This week, we explain the Gladys Berejiklian story in detail for you. Free speech under attack again in Australia. We already have a Ministry of Truth and a censorship czar, but the Labor government wants even more restrictions on social media, to keep us all safe. A leading US Democratic Party lawyer tells the other side that the legal case against Donald Trump should not proceed. And those rising energy and housing prices, where did they really come from, and what should we do about it? G'day and welcome to episode 212 of The Other Side Australia. I'm Damian Coory and this is your weekly shortcut to all of the news of the week for the weekend starting Friday night, June 30, 2023. Financial New Year Eve here on ADH TV. This is the show where we take things a little slower, we go a little deeper, and we try to explain the news more clearly for you so you can catch up in under an hour of your very busy time. Let's get into it. The Premier of the great state of Victoria, Daniel Andrews, has finally revealed details of his latest very secretive trip to China between March 27 and April 1 this year. It was his 7th trip since becoming Premier in 2014. That means if you take out the COVID years, it's around one trip a year, which is completely normal for an Australian state Premier. The last trip cost just a touch more than $80,000 of taxpayers' money. You may not have heard much about the latest trip that Delightful Dan made because he didn't do the usual thing of inviting any Aussie media to go along with him and report on things. I mean, that's not really necessary, is it? All that accountability, free speech and democratic behaviour getting in the way of all the important business that Dan's got to do with our communist friends to the north. He said the trip was to promote, quote, education, trade and tourism ties with China, and that it consisted primarily of government-to-government meetings as an important step towards constructive and mutually beneficial post-pandemic engagement between Victoria and China, those two great countries. That's nice. Apparently he didn't bring up the matter of the detained Australian journalist Cheng Lei or the writer Yang Hengjun with any of the government people that he met with while he was in the major cities of Beijing, Nanjing and Chengdu. That's because Australian Labor doesn't do human rights and civil liberties anymore. That's so last century. The purpose of the trip was to increase international student numbers, according to the Premier, because that's a great export industry for Australia. But the Victorian Liberal Party wanted Dan to explain why he wasn't taking any of the state's university chancellors with him, if that was the main point of the trip. Good question. Very good question. Yes, ties with China are very important for Australia, and China is where the money is right now for business. But why all the secrecy? Transparency is critical, especially when our leaders are visiting a communist single-party authoritarian state. And why not create policies that enable a business-related trade delegation to benefit from and lead these kinds of trips? Business-to-business meetings often yield better results than government-to-government meetings. Business people know how to do business. Career politicians, not so much. Well, the first half of the year is behind us, guys. How time flies. This is the show that brings you the news for normal Australians from a mainstream classical liberal perspective instead of a noisy, woke minority perspective. And the left-wing bureaucrats that run Australia do not like those of us not on their side of politics having a voice. That's a voice that's not allowed, or any kind of platform for that matter. The top public servant bureaucrats, who are the people who really run Australia these days, are busy telling the politicians, who are the people who pretend to run Australia these days, to bring in even more laws to shut us up, and you up, especially if you're an older, whitish male, or a non-white human of any gender, race or sexuality who isn't left-wing like them. We already have some of the most free speech stifling defamation laws and contempt of court laws in the so-called free world. Enough to make doing a show like this every week a personal hazard. But that's not enough for these top public servant control freaks. Oh no. And as if having an e-safety commissioner, a ministry of truth that can demand things be taken down off social media whenever they like, isn't enough, we now have the joy of new proposed laws that will ban misinformation and disinformation. Isn't that great? Yes, but there's just one tiny problem. Who decides what misinformation or disinformation is? Oops, yeah, we forgot about that little problem, didn't we? It's not like it's at the very core of the entire free speech debate or anything. It's not like every dystopian novel ever written starts with the evil government squashing free speech under some kind of Ministry of Truth. 1984, V for Vendetta, Harry Potter, Brave New World. But yes, of course we should have more restriction of free speech in Australia because we need the government to keep us safe. We need the government to protect us from nasty words and bad ideas. Under the new laws that Albo is proposing, digital platforms could face massive business and job-destroying sized penalties for failing to address systemic disinformation and misinformation. Systemic, there's that wonderful word again. Okay, what does that mean? Who will be the Ministry of Truth in this scenario? It will be ACMA, the Australian Communications and Media Authority, the mob who regulate things like this show, for example, which makes me kind of nervous even talking about this. You see how censorship works, folks? Subtle, subtle fear. The Minister of Communications, Michelle Rowland, said the proposed legislation was aimed at protecting Australians from the growing threat of bad information.
The Communications Minister today pushing ahead with a plan to crack down on harmful mistruths and the digital platforms that allow them to spread.
This is an important step to keep all Australians safe.
Keep us safe. What could possibly go wrong with allowing the bureaucrats inside our government to decide what constitutes disinformation and misinformation? I can't think of any recent examples where government policies have shoved down our throats in the name of keeping us safe that turned out to be wrong. Border closures, lockdowns, mandating... Sorry, forgive me, I'm just getting sidetracked. Anyway, here's how Channel 9 reported it.
Under proposed new laws, search engines, social media platforms, dating websites and online marketplaces could be hit with fines of between nearly $3 and $7 million, or up to 5% of their global turnover, whichever's highest, if they fail to properly tackle disinformation.
I'm sorry, what? 5% of their global turnover? What right do petty bureaucrats in Australia have to get their little mitts on the global turnover of these companies? I mean, they'll just pack up and leave Australia. But wait, it gets even better.
And for the first time, the communications watchdog could demand access to digital providers' documents related to fake news.
It will essentially mean that the regulator is able to look under the hood of what the platforms are doing. This is not about regulating free speech.
Oh no. No. Misinformation and disinformation sows division within the community. It undermines trust and can threaten public health and safety, says Albo's Communication Minister. Okay, fine. The government says it's not about regulating free speech, so nothing to worry about then. I feel totally reassured, don't you? There won't be any abuse of this for political gain. I mean, let's look at America. One recent example of political misinformation that the Americans managed was that fake Hunter Biden laptop story. Thank God they suppressed that fake news before the 2020 US presidential election. Otherwise, Donald Trump would have almost certainly won. Oh wait, I forgot. It wasn't fake news. The laptop was real. So Trump might well be president if not for the active suppression of that story under the guise of it being misinformation or disinformation. Oh, but come on, this is Australia. It's not like any bureaucrats here would be pro-big government or anti-small government liberalism or anything. I mean, it's not like bureaucrats benefit from big government, right? Of course, the media went ballistic over this. I mean, this is an outrageous further infringement on free speech in Australia. So journalists everywhere were just up in arms. Nope. The only media that gave a damn was the conservative media. The mainstream media and the left-wing media will all benefit from this. It's only platforms like ours, our cousins over at Sky News, that are likely to get whacked, along with the conservative alternative media. We battle censorship on the online platforms endlessly, as Sky News' Shari Markson explained on her show this week.
battled to get their journalism on Hunter Biden out, and now that's led to official investigations and charges. I'm sorry, but who decides what is misinformation? This is extremely dangerous territory. And 5% of a company's worth is enormous, potentially tens of millions of dollars. The tech giants will play ball with the government. They've already said they're not going to oppose this.
No, because the tech companies are all from the epicenter of woke. San Francisco, California, USA. Shari Markson's report demonstrated clearly why we need to be worried about the way that this Labor government defines misinformation and disinformation.
What process will be followed here? Is it fact checkers like at Media Watch, the supposed arbiter of truth in the journalism industry, or are the fact checkers employed by the Labor government? If it's a government deciding what is misinformation, then this is government-enforced censorship like we see in China and other dictatorships. And it's not just Wuhan and Hunter Biden that has been labelled misinformation. Something else is now being called misinformation.
Every bit of disinformation and misinformation and scare campaigns that exist in this debate. The No campaign are importing American-style Trump politics, and its weapon of choice is misinformation.
Aboriginal Affairs Minister Linda Burney there explaining that if you oppose The Voice, you're peddling misinformation or disinformation. It's not that you have a sensible worldview and you're concerned about the legal implications and the long-term implications of changing the Constitution, or that you're a well-considered person who's thoughtfully thought through things and evaluated your position and decided that no, on this occasion you're going to vote no. No, you're just a racist right-wing nutjob cooker. So no political abuse here, folks, of the terms misinformation or disinformation or the definitions. We're just keeping you safe from dangerous ideas. We're keeping you safe from right-wing nutjob cookers. And we, your friendly left-wing government, will decide who the right-wing nutjobs are. All good? No problem. It's nuts. But you know, the funny thing is, and the disturbing thing is, we already have a Ministry of Truth. We already have a censorship authority dressed up as a safety thing. It's called the E-Safety Commission and the E-Safety Commissioner. And she has been very, very busy this week too. Twitter has been given 28 days to respond to a legal notice from the Australian government or face a penalty, just a little one, teeny one, of up to $700,000 a day for continued breaches simply because our E-Safety Commissioner says the company isn't doing enough to tackle hate on the platform. Now, of course, this has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that Twitter is no longer home to left-wing control. Oh no, it has nothing to do with Elon Musk buying Twitter and vowing to protect free speech for everybody. As a centre-right leaning semi-conservative person on Twitter, I've got to say I've only noticed improvement since Musk took over and less abuse from radical left-wingers, frankly. So this E-Safety Commissioner, who is taking our tax money as a salary, isn't representing me in this action. The E-Safety Commissioner's name, by the way, is Julie Grant, and she said that, quote, Twitter appears to have dropped the ball on tackling hate. Oh, okay. And a third of the complaints that she's received about online hate in the past 12 months were directed at Twitter. So, hey, it must be true then. The level of online abuse is already inexcusably high, she says. But if you're a First Nations Australian, you are disabled, or identify as LGBTQIQ+, you experience online hate at double the rate of the rest of the population. Really? Or are there just more complaints? I mean, what unbiased, neutral research has she actually conducted on this? And if you're trying to shove your ideology down people's throats, wouldn't you expect a backlash? But to the E-Safety Commission, This is as scientific as their analysis gets. Ready? We're getting more complaints from people, so that must accurately reflect what's really happening in the community. No, it doesn't work that way. Ask any market researcher, pollster, or person who actually understands statistics and mathematics. And try being a conservative in 21st century Australia, or a practicing Christian, or even a classical liberal like me, and you might get an idea what hate looks like. Elon Musk created a stir this week by refusing to adopt the made-up words of the modern identity politics Nazis. The word cis or cisgender are considered slurs on this platform, he said. In case you're not up with the latest lunacy from the gender ideology crowd, the word cis means you identify as the gender of your biological sex. You have a penis and you consider yourself a man, which is very, very uncool these days. All the cool kids are looking at their anatomy and going, hey, I'm the opposite of that. So it was very, very brave of Elon to call out the made-up word cisgender and note that it is used in a way to demean and put down people who are not fans of trans ideology. But of course, there is no connection between that policy of Twitter's and this sort of crackdown on Twitter from a left-wing Australian government. Oh no. Well, guess what? The E-Safety Commissioner, Julie Grant, is a former Twitter employee, as independent journalist Rukshan Fernando pointed out this week.
There's a lot of concerns about her involvement in this, being an ex-Twitter employee, and a conflict of interest potentially as well in her doing this type of work. But anyway, let's have a look at her comments that she made recently on a television network here in Australia, SBS News.
A third of all reports into our office of online hate are coming from Twitter. It's been a huge surge since October 22 when Elon Musk took over. And of course, there have been a confluence of factors that have added to this. You know, Twitter's always been fiery in terms of discourse, but it's turned into an absolute bin fire.
Yeah, so I've just stopped that there. Absolute bin fire. I don't think Twitter's turned into an absolute bin fire. Twitter's actually a place now where you can have reasonable discussions and debates and conversations without getting banned for the most ludicrous things, right? For hurting people's feelings and all sorts of stuff that you used to get banned before. So it's more of an open, free speech style platform, which is great. So she's calling that a bin fire, which really just goes to her own personal views.
Yep, spot on, Rukshan. And that is not okay. Her own personal views about Twitter are not representative of all Australians, especially of those of us not of the left-wing persuasion. So please, get lost.
You have to understand when this lady is speaking, you have to look at her as a representative of the Australian government, as the E-Safety Commissioner. So the terms of reference that she's using, the language that she's using, there has to be some sort of underlying basis for those type of terms. But a lot of it's coming through as if it's her own feelings.
Very, very hard to be permanently banned from Twitter.
So again, she's saying very, very hard to be permanently banned from Twitter, as if that's a bad thing in terms of a platform that you can't permanently silence someone. Again, listen very carefully. This is a government official technically saying that it's very, very bad that a platform can't permanently ban someone, right?
Yeah, what a shame. We can't permanently ban the people who have wrong think and who do wrong speak. God, we are in such a mess in Australia. And Rukshan and I better watch out, right? As should Topher and Avi and Matt Wong and everybody else in the alternative media. Daisy Cousins and everybody on ADH. I mean, this is just frightening stuff. I've been a journalist for a very long time. I'm not young. I grew up in Queensland. I started my journalism career under the regime of Joh Bjelke-Petersen. And I never felt as worried as I do now about speaking out against the government back then, even under that well-known sort of very authoritarian style of government and corruption that we had in Queensland back then. So this is really serious. And most people don't even see it, and they don't even care.
A lot of the changes to the algorithms have made people feel like you see more toxicity, much worse, much more coarse discourse.
Again, she's talking about how people have been made to feel by the Twitter algorithm, right? This is not a regards to something that's black and white. If some rules have been broken, or if someone's broken some rules about discrimination, it's nothing like this. It's just saying people have been made to feel this way, and the algorithm makes people feel in a certain way. Now the Australian government, through Julie, is getting involved in people's feelings. It's crazy stuff.
But without lifting the hood and using these transparency powers, we really don't know what's happening. And this is where we're trying to get to the bottom of things.
So this is what it's all about. She wants Twitter to give her information on users, on how their policies works. She wants information on the algorithm. So the government now is wanting to regulate how private companies do this, so it fits in with the government's own desires.
So they want the social media companies to give them information on you, on what you're doing on social media. And why does this bureaucrat get to drive her own agenda against Twitter and against all of us in the name of safety, but which seems to reflect a particular political worldview and an ideology that she and the government hold? And how much do these bureaucrats get paid? How much of our money goes to indulging their pet projects?
It's very important to note that the eSafety Commission, this Australian government body, is being the people that are working there are earning almost $3.5 million amongst themselves. Julie herself, her salary as eSafety Commissioner is about $450,000, approximately $444,983,000, right? That's how much she's getting paid from the taxpayer. On top of that, they're doing this, getting lawyers involved, writing legal notices to Twitter.
Yeah, it's costing us a fortune for them to push their agenda. This is not okay. This is not the role of government in a liberal democracy. It's the role of government in a nanny state or an authoritarian state. Independent online journalist Rukshan Fernando reporting there, and I urge you to watch Rukshan while you still can, doing the work that our official paid media don't do. You can check out Rukshan's work on @RealRukshan on Twitter and YouTube. Well, as you may have heard, New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption has handed down its report into the former New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian, and she was a bit naughty. Let's explain the whole thing from its beginning. It's a fun story, so settle in. Around the time of the state election in March 2015, Ms Berejiklian started a romantic relationship with Darryl Maguire, the Liberal MP for the electorate of Wagga Wagga. She was the MP for the electorate of Willoughby in Sydney, and she was the Minister for Transport and Industrial Relations. And Maguire is on record as saying that their romance started in 2013, but whatever. Anyway, the Libs won the 2015 election and Gladys became the Treasurer, and nobody knew about their romance. Then in 2018, Big Darryl was named in an ICAC inquiry with allegations made that he had misused his position as an MP to secure big property deals with developers, including a Chinese company. He also admitted to running a business from his government office that involved arranging visas for cash. This became the subject of another ICAC probe, and Maguire was charged for giving false evidence. But Dazza refused to quit for a while. Then he was finally kicked out of the Liberal Party and resigned as the member for Wagga Wagga. He told Gladys in a text message to make a show of it all. Get stuck into me. Kick the shit out of me. It's good for party morale. Then in October 2020, when Gladys was Premier and doing a really horrible job of managing COVID, as all Aussie premiers did, but being slightly less horrible at it than the rest, things got spicy. New ICAC hearings into the alleged misdeeds began. Mr Maguire's involvement in a $300 million land sale to Country Garden, a Chinese company, in 2017 was explored. The deal didn't happen. But if it had, Maguire was going to get a nice fee, almost $700,000. Nothing illegal about that, of course, but the inquiry was told that he gave the Premier's personal email address to the seller. He secured a meeting with the Minister for Roads to rezone the site. And he's on tape talking about the deal with Gladys, saying how it could help him with his debts if the deal goes through. To which she replied, I don't need to know about that bit. And it was this hearing that Gladys came out and admitted her romantic relationship with Daryl. By then, it had been over for a few months, and she said, "I'm an extremely private person, and I stuffed up in my personal life." She didn't admit any wrongdoing, and she didn't resign. But a year later, October 2021, ICAC announced its investigation had been extended to include her. So she immediately resigned, stepping down as Premier, and then she got a nice senior role at Optus in the private sector. Then ICAC hearings got going again, and the question turned to whether Gladys had helped Mr Maguire advance special projects in Wagga Wagga, whether she failed to report his possible corrupt conduct, despite possibly maybe kind of knowing about it, and if she actually did anything herself to allow or encourage any of Maguire's alleged corrupt conduct. ICAC wanted to know about an incident where she asked Dominic Perrottet, who was treasurer at the time, to allocate $140 million of taxpayers' money for a hospital in Wagga. They wanted to investigate what her involvement was in getting a $10 million grant for the Riverina Conservatorium of Music and a $5.5 million grant for the Australian Clay Target Association. Now, these are all legitimate grants, they're all perfectly fine organisations, and the money, I'm sure, is being used wisely. But tapped phone conversations were revealed between Gladys and Maguire in which she said she would hold off on sacking a public servant who was helping Maguire with that Conservatorium of Music grant. She also tells Maguire that she will keep throwing money at Wagga to make sure he wins a by-election there. Quote, "Don't you worry about that," to borrow a popular phrase from another colourful premier from the last century. Don't you worry about that. Then in November last year, Mr Maguire was charged with criminal conspiracy related to alleged visa and migrant fraud, and that's now before the courts, that matter. And now here we are, 20 long months after its last hearing, the New South Wales ICAC, setting a new bar for bureaucratic efficiency, finally hands down its report, finding that Gladys failed her ministerial duties by not notifying ICAC of her suspicion that Maguire had engaged in behaviour that might have been considered corrupt, that there was a clear, quote, conflict of interest between her public duty and her private interests, that she breached public trust by awarding the grants to the Clay Target Association and the Riverina Conservatorium while she was in a close personal relationship with Maguire, and that the funding was influenced by her relationship with Mr Maguire. Pretty damning stuff. So what happens now? Well, not much. ICAC is not pursuing charges against Ms Berejiklian for any offence, saying that, quote, "The Commission is not of the opinion that consideration should be given to obtaining the advice of the Director of Public Prosecutions." It is getting the advice from the DPP on whether criminal proceedings should start against Maguire, though. Optus have indicated that they don't see a connection between what Gladys did while she was Premier and her job now. And the ICAC has released more text messages between Maguire and the former Premier to demonstrate that despite Gladys playing down the relationship, that it was, in fact, serious and ongoing. One of the United States' most respected constitutional experts, Harvard Law School Professor Emeritus Alan Dershowitz, has told the other side that the legal case against Donald Trump should be abandoned in the national interest. Professor Dershowitz is a self-proclaimed Liberal Democrat and a Democratic Party voter, and he says he doesn't want to see Trump return to the presidency. But Alan Dershowitz told me on Tuesday night's episode of The Other Side Interviews this week that anti-Trump activists are taking serious risks with the Constitution and the law to stop Trump, and it's damaging to the due legal process. And ultimately, it endangers the rights of all Americans. He warned Australia against following America by permitting the political abuse of the criminal justice system by people who want to attack their political opponents. Sadly, this warning may be a bit too late.
Look, I'm a liberal Democrat. I voted against Donald Trump twice. I fully intend to vote against him a third time. But I put civil liberties and constitutional rights before I put partisanship. And so the premise of my book is that although the ends and the goals of people who are trying to get Trump are laudable, making sure he's not the next president, the means that are being used by many, many people on the left are ignoble, unconstitutional, unethical, and just dead wrong. They're targeting him. They're going after him using different standards of justice than are used against other people. They're taking shortcuts with the Constitution and with the law, and they're endangering the rights of all Americans, liberal, conservative, pro-Trump, anti-Trump, conservative, Republicans, everybody. And so my goal is to set the legal system straight and not to allow Donald Trump and the hatred that has been generated toward him to destroy our legal system.
There seems to be a lack of understanding that if we lose these fundamental ideas and concepts, that it doesn't matter what side of politics you're on, this could affect you.
It's not a misunderstanding. By most people, they fully understand it. They just reject it.
Right.
They think Trump is so evil and so dangerous that they're prepared to knowingly take these risks with our liberty. They know that if you establish the precedent against Trump, it will be used against Biden. It will be used against members of Congress on the Democratic side. Ultimately, it will be used against me and against other Americans. They know that intellectually, but they really do have what has been called Trump derangement syndrome. I have friends who I can talk to about every subject, but when you try to talk to them about Donald Trump, they go absolutely crazy. I mean, you probably heard the name Larry David, famous, comedian, Curb Your Enthusiasm. We were close friends. Done dinners all the time, He worked out in my basement gym. I helped his daughter get into college. But as soon as I defended Trump, he could not talk to me. I said to him one day, Larry, can we talk? No, you're disgusting. You're on their side. Americans have divided our country into two sides. You're for Trump or you're against Trump, and there's no middle ground. You can't say, well, Trump did a pretty good thing on the Abraham Accords with Israel, but he did a terrible thing with immigration policy, which is what I believe. But you can't say that. You're either 100% for Trump or 100% against Trump.
That's Professor Alan Dershowitz joining me on our Tuesday night show, The Other Side Interviews. You can watch the full interview with Professor Dershowitz here on ADH TV on demand. So a couple of years ago, in the middle of the COVID overreaction, I and a number of other commentators were warning about the long-term economic impacts of spending so much money to soften the blow, of going into debt more deeply than the country had ever done so before, to indulge the lazy and risk-averse policy making of our petulant state governments with their lockdowns and border closures. Hard-working small business people saw their life's work go up in flames. But that was okay at the time because employees had JobKeeper. Payments to stay home and stay isolated and watch Netflix, guaranteeing the electoral success of Labor and the Greens in the years that followed and confirming the suicide of the Liberal Party of Australia under ScoMo and Frydenberg. Shut up, you right-wing nutjob, people screamed. All you care about is the economy, not people's health and lives. As if the economy has nothing to do with people's health and lives. Deep thinkers, many of our fellow left-leaning Aussies are not. But they're excellent moralisers, the lefties, and very quick to judge, blame and name-call others. Just no substance or reality to back up that moralising. Lockdowns were a mistake. They caused much more trauma and loss of life than they alleviated. And border closures that tore families away from dying loved ones and trapped expats overseas were unjustifiable and immoral. So little was gained for all that bad policy making and spending. And now we are paying the price. But you won't hear that story from the major parties because they're both to blame. And you won't hear it from the mainstream media for exactly the same reason. And if you listen to and watch the ABC, you'd never think there was a connection between COVID mismanagement and net zero extremism and the current cost of living crisis. It all seems lost on the lovies at the ABC, who can't think more than one step ahead. Endless stories and interviews about the dreadful rise in cost of living and the poor people and the homeless, and it's awful and horrible. Just put on ABC News any day. But it's funny, there's just like no discussion whatsoever about two of the main causes of all that. Lockdowns, which they self-righteously championed, and the suicidal lunacy, for Australia at least, of net zero, which they self-righteously champion. Ah, the ABC. Never wrong, never sorry. Well, the minutes came out from the Reserve Bank meeting that led to the latest rate hikes 2 weeks ago. Those hikes brought us to 4.1% base interest rate. That's the highest it's been in 11 years. And it's up from 0.1% just over a year ago. That's an astronomically fast rise of 4 whole percentage points, or 400 basis points, as the cool finance kids like to say, because, you know, it sounds more impressive and confuses everyone else so they can feel important. Anyway, the minutes from the Reserve Bank of Australia's meetings come out usually a couple of weeks after the meeting day, and they give us insight into what might be coming next, but not so much this time. RBA Governor Philip Lowe said, quote, "Some further tightening of monetary policy may be required." Now that's just financial jargon waffle that means more interest rate rises might be needed to ensure that inflation returns to target in a reasonable time frame. The target inflation rate for Australia's economy, the level that policymakers like to keep things at and think is a healthy rate of inflation, not too much, not too little, is 2.3%. Sorry, not 2.3, 2.23%. Okay, so somewhere between 2 and 3%. So it'll all depend upon how the economy and the inflation evolve, says Mr. Lowe. The new decision, by the way, first Tuesday of the month, so it's coming up, all right, this coming Tuesday. And that's all just a fancy way of Philip Lowe saying, we don't know yet, all right? So the minutes also said that the board members, quote, agreed to continue to monitor trends in household spending closely and consider the implication for the inflation outlook, as well as developments in the global economy and the domestic labour market, which is, again, just a long-winded way of saying, we don't know yet. We're going to see if people keep spending or stop spending so much, first of all, and then we'll see what's going on around the world, and then we'll look at the unemployment and the wages data, and if inflation keeps going up, then, yeah, interest rates will need to go up also. So, got it. But we never go any deeper than that. So let's go a bit deeper than that. Why do the world's central banks use interest rates to control inflation? The simple answer is, it's all they've got. As the journalistic cliche goes, it's the main lever to control the economy. But it's a blunt instrument. Pull too hard and you could bring on a recession and even a depression. Now, The Economist magazine has a very good little explainer on YouTube about all of this. I mean, what even are interest rates and who sets them?
There's no single interest rate in the economy. You've got thousands of banks setting their own commercial rates. That's all influenced, though, by the interest rate that the central bank sets.
A central bank is like a bank for banks. Just like you and your savings account, banks also earn interest when they leave money with a central bank.
Commercial banks have these things called reserves. So that's a bit like their cash on hand. Commercial banks lend those excess reserves to each other at an interest rate, and they also can deposit their excess reserves at the central bank. And when they do that, they can earn an interest rate. Ordinary people can't access the interest rate on the excess reserves, but it still affects them.
Right. It still affects us because if banks like the CBA, NAB and Westpac can get more interest by just leaving their excess money, their excess reserves parked in the Reserve Bank of Australia and earn a nice 4.1% deposit rate, that would be more than they could get lending it out to us, then they just won't bother lending it out to us. And that is the central bank's lever. By pulling the base interest rate up, it means that commercial and retail banks won't lend so much to business and to people like us to buy houses and cars. So that is supposed to then slow down the economy, slow down our demand for stuff, which should cause prices to go down. Things get cheaper when there's less demand for them, thereby reducing inflation. Simple, I think.
When central banks raise interest rates, they're trying to control inflation, how fast prices rise for everyone.
They were 129, now they 139, and that's in the space of 4 weeks.
Central banks like the Fed or the Bank of England or the European Central Bank are all trying to hit an inflation target of 2%. Interest rates are a really powerful tool that they have to do that.
If inflation is seen as too high, that's when banks raise interest rates. The change spreads through the financial system and slows down the rate of inflation.
Got it. But again, this is a sledgehammer, a blunt instrument. They have to be careful how hard they pull that lever, and how raising interest rates is going to affect inflation and all of us depends on a lot of other stuff that's going on in the economy.
Take mortgages. In places like Finland or Australia, lots of people have mortgages with variable interest rates.
If you've got a variable rate mortgage where the interest rate that you pay is linked to the central bank's interest rate, then higher interest rates mean that essentially immediately the higher rate will translate into less cash to spend on other things.
Less spare cash means households will spend less. And less spending means businesses will be warier of raising prices. And it's not just consumers who will tighten the purse strings.
When interest rates rise, then businesses will find it more expensive to borrow and invest. That generally means less economic activity. It might mean fewer jobs are created.
Uh-oh. I see where this is heading.
The trick is judging how far to go. In 1981, the Federal Reserve, America's central bank, allowed interest rates to rise to a whopping 19%. The move curbed inflation, but it led to widespread economic pain.
I regret to say that we're in the worst economic mess since the Great Depression.
It is very difficult to get inflation under control without severely denting economic activity.
But don't worry, folks, the Greens and Labor have got the answer. Just give everyone more money. Put up the dole, put up wages, create government housing out of thin air. It's easy. All the world's problems are just because of some old, fat, white, straight guy hogging all the chocolates and eating all the pies, right?
A little inflation is okay. It keeps the economy moving at a sensible speed. But inflation staying high for too long is a problem. Higher prices means employees will need higher wages, pushing up costs for businesses. That could drive up prices further, potentially leading to an upward spiral of wages and prices.
Oh boy, do not tell Adam Bant or Jim Chalmers about that. I don't want to upset them. They're not that bright, and they're nice guys, and they're just trying to help. So maybe we shouldn't confront them with anything like, reality or facts or anything. That excellent little explainer was put together by The Economist magazine, and you can find it and all their other content online in the usual places. The Australian newspaper reported this week that the union movement is going to be throwing its weight behind the yes vote for the voice to Parliament. The paper says they're vowing to mobilise their members and actively campaign for a voice to Parliament across social media, workplaces, universities and neighbourhoods. All this, as the latest news poll conducted exclusively for the Australian newspaper, shows that the support for yes is tanking further and no is leading in all states except New South Wales and Victoria. Nationally, no is on 47 and yes on 43, with 10% undecided. In Queensland, no is miles ahead, 54 to 40, while in good old Victoria, yes leads 48 to 41. You can expect more personal attack ads and emotional name calling and cries of "shut up racist" as the yes campaign get more desperate and the certainty of defeat draws nearer. It seems we're not as gullible, ignorant and stupid as they were all hoping for us to be. And we do actually want to understand the detail and the implications of this thing. And no, that is not scaremongering. It's prudent and wise caution, something that mature grown-ups do. The referendum is likely to be held in mid-October, although like so much about The Voice, nobody really knows. A new poll in America has revealed that when it comes to Big Brother and Big Brother style big government spying on your every move, that it seems Americans love it much more than they thought they did. Australians certainly do. I mean, we knew that already. We're like the Canadians. We love having cameras on the street peeking into our personal space, our cars, and seeing whether we're on our mobile phones. We love handing over to banks the right to control our money and whether we're allowed to take out cash and how much. Those of us who support good old-fashioned classical liberalism, where we didn't hand all our freedom to the government so it can play mummy and daddies and keep us safe, we look to America and free states like Florida and Texas as the last bastions of small government, skeptical, good-thinking places on earth. But maybe not anymore after this piece from the Boston Globe's columnist Jeff Jacoby. He wrote this week about an opinion poll of 2,000 American adults by the think tank the Cato Institute, which asked the question, quote, would you favour or oppose the government installing surveillance cameras in every household to reduce domestic violence, abuse and other illegal activity? Jacoby said he was shocked by the results. 14% of the survey respondents, nearly 1 in 6, told the Cato Institute that they would favour such government surveillance inside their homes. Another 10% said they had no opinion either way. In other words, he notes, a quarter of those surveyed wouldn't object to the government watching and recording everything that they say and do. The scariest part was this though. Support for 24/7 surveillance was especially high among those younger than 30. 3 out of 10 adults born after 1993 said they would be fine with it. 30%. In George Orwell's classic novel 1984, which was written in 1949, there was an instrument called the telescreen. Orwell wrote that it could be dimmed, but there was no way of turning it off completely. You had to live in the assumption that every sound you made was overheard, and, except in darkness, every movement scrutinised. What a visionary Orwell was. Jacoby writes that in Orwell's book, the sinister telescreen reinforced the right of the state, symbolised by Big Brother, to see and hear everything. Private conversations, words written in a diary, a rendezvous with a lover. The government could keep tabs on all of it. And poor old Winston Smith, the protagonist of Orwell's novel, is no hero, of course. He's a weak and wistful man who resents the regime and is ultimately broken for it. The book's final words are among the most devastating in all of literature. He loved Big Brother. So maybe we will never have a fast and violent revolution as the communists dream, but worse, a slow, technology-driven creep into tyranny. The Cato Institute says they don't know how much this preference for security over privacy or freedom is something unique to the young generation or is simply the result of youth itself, but they hypothesise that Americans who grew up during the Cold War with an awareness of Soviet repression know how to spot the dangers of giving the government too much power to monitor people, whereas members of Generation Z came of age after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union and haven't got a clue. But the Boston Globe's Jeff Jacoby is sceptical of that theory. He says totalitarian tyranny didn't vanish with the end of the Cold War and that, quote, monstrous governments in the 21st century are no less oppressive than the Soviet Union was in the 20th. Think of the cruelties inflicted by today's regimes in China, Iran or North Korea. He thinks a better explanation is that Gen Z or Gen Z has been indoctrinated to regard safety, not freedom, as the highest value, the highest good. So much so that many would rather be under the non-stop watch of the state than face the possibility of being abused or endangered. Jacoby writes that if so, they're in for a fearful awakening. What little protection they might gain from being under the authorities' constant watch is nothing compared with the peril they would face. And he quotes Benjamin Franklin's famous line, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Speaking of Big Brother, you probably heard the news a couple of months ago that the Queensland Police Service is going to recruit 2,500 foreign police between now and 2028. The recruits will be required to have sufficient policing experiences in their own home countries, but they don't have to be an Australian citizen or even a permanent resident, thanks to a special deal made with the federal government. I'm not sure this is going to work too well. But they have to do it because they've made becoming a police officer at home a very undesirable thing that a lot of young people do not want to do, and they just can't get recruits anymore. But policing is an extremely important thing for a state and nation to get right, and our governments are stuffing it up royally. Policing is something that has to be perfectly balanced. It's got to be respected and supported with very high public trust, and to maintain that public trust, it's got to never overstep the boundaries of acceptable force. It must never be used for political purposes, and it must never become corrupted. It's so important for any civil society to get law enforcement right, because without it, we simply cannot have a successful, healthy society. This week, I want to show you an interesting and quite eye-opening interview from the US. Everyone knows that America has some serious crime problems, mainly in states and cities that have adopted a kind of woke ideology in their policing. But why is that? What are the specific things that these governments are doing wrong that are ruining these once great cities like San Francisco, New York, LA and Chicago, and causing people to flee to more conservative, safer states like Texas and Florida? And how do we avoid the same sort of policies ruining our Australian cities in the same way? This question of what's going wrong is one that the American public policy think tank and research house called the Manhattan Institute has been focusing on. The institute was founded in 1978, and Rehan Salam, a former executive editor of National Review magazine and a fellow at the University of Chicago Institute of Politics, is the Manhattan Institute's current president. And he told Marissa Straight in an interview with the US media site PragerU that academia and media have played a big part in the decline in the American approach to law enforcement.
Over the past 20 years or so, there's been a kind of intellectual revolution in elite academia and media in which people have decided that many highly effective law enforcement approaches are racist. And this is a terrible irony because starting in the 1990s, what you saw in New York, LA, many other major cities, is an incredible advance in policing. We really identified effective, proactive policing strategies that helped stop crime before it starts. You had this big decline in crime in cities across the country, but in New York and LA, it actually went even further. You didn't just have 1 decade of crime decline, you had 2 decades of crime decline in those places.
But unfortunately, Mr. Salam says those great results in the 90s and early 2000s have been lost in the past couple of decades.
But then now suddenly you say, okay, these policies that are evidence-based policies that have proven their worth, policies that have saved hundreds of thousands of lives, overwhelmingly the lives of people living in disadvantaged neighborhoods, minority communities. I mean, it's incredible. This was something that increased life expectancy in our urban cores quite a bit. People decided this is racist and bad, and what we need to do is embrace decarceration and depolicing. Decarceration, well, basically we incarcerate too many people in the United States because Denmark incarcerates fewer people, therefore we should too.
Salam told PragerU that unlike Denmark, America sadly has a violence problem. But it's very clear that in cities that have stronger law enforcement, the violence is much more manageable.
We've seen that incapacitating violent people makes communities safer. There's a great deal of evidence for this. Basically we decided, okay, because we have this arbitrary view that there's some correct number and it is arbitrarily tied to some random country somewhere else in the world that's very different from our country, that has very different conditions from our country. This became a meme. This became this idea that people became obsessed with.
Mr. Salam says government bureaucracy, and especially the government prosecutors, have supported a soft-on-crime approach for too long. And while it will take a long time to fix, the pushback is happening. He says people are starting to change their minds about traditional social arguments against being tougher on crime. Arguments that have come from our universities and criminology courses that focus on perpetrators more than victims.
Part of the argument, as I understand it, is that the crime increase isn't in fact that big. It's exaggerated. It is something that is a product of media hype and manipulation. So that is one line of argument. When that doesn't quite work, some people who are a bit more honest, some honest ideologues, and they're out there, will say that's an acceptable price to pay, because it is such a terrible thing to incarcerate a violent offender. Or, well, one thing you'll hear people say is that, oh, actually, we're not decarcerating. We're not letting people go who are violent offenders. That's just not true.
It's just because they're smoking weed or something.
Exactly,
they got sent to jail because they were smoking weed, like something like that.
Flatly false. That is flatly false. That is not true. So again, you'll have some honest people who will acknowledge that, hey, look, that's a trade-off. You know, you accept that cities are going to be somewhat more violent, but we're still in the range where it's okay, and you know that's just part of life in a free society.
But the argument that offends Dr. Salam the most is the one that attacks law enforcement officers, the police, in claiming that they aren't doing their jobs properly.
The problem is that police are pouting and they're going on a strike and they're not doing their jobs. That is an argument that I find particularly offensive, partly because, you know, you're essentially seeing the passage of laws in a range of different cities, which are basically making policing more dangerous for police officers. You are saying that you are not allowed to, for example, restrain people in certain ways that, you know, by the way, could be safe and responsible. You're saying you're simply not allowed to do that because we do not want to have any negative headlines. You know, we just want to kind of totally zero out that possibility. So what you're saying is that we're going to make the job more dangerous. We're also going to demonize you. And then, by the way, we're not going to, you know, hey, come on and join the police force. Hey, you know, it's crazy.
Yep, it's crazy, all right. Who'd want to be a police officer? Lots and lots of risk, limited pay, and even if you treated it as a service vocation and were really committed to it, what community praise and support do you get if we all start demonising the police? The primary role of police is to stop serious violent crime. Sure, they should also enforce petty crime, because if we don't, it sends a dangerous message to those who'd push the envelope to more violent crime later on. But our state governments are using the police as revenue raisers by making them chase traffic offences against otherwise law-abiding citizens as a priority, and as social workers sent to not just police but to calm and counsel in domestic violence situations. And now, as we saw horrifyingly in Victoria primarily in 2021, they are being used as political pawns, being forced to act as agents of government in quashing protests. While Melbourne was by far the country's most disgraceful example of this, other cities weren't without similar issues. And so, what a surprise, Aussie police services have a recruitment crisis. So Queensland is going to bring in 2,500 police from overseas. I'm sure that's going to work out really well. If we're going to attract young people to want to have a career in policing, we're going to have to face some hard truths. Mr. Salam says in America, there's definitely been way too much emphasis on the well-being of the perpetrators and not enough emphasis on how the police are feeling.
There are people in law enforcement who feel frightened, who feel afraid, who believe that their city governments, that the local authorities are not going to back them up when they are doing the right thing, when they're being proactive, when they're being responsible, not using excessive force, but acting appropriately to keep the public safe. Now, I'm not saying that law enforcement everywhere in the country is perfect. One of the great things that happened in New York City and Los Angeles and other major cities is that you saw police forces become dramatically more professional and more responsive. Now, again, that is something where you can always improve, but I would argue that the truly racist cop is the one who doesn't do her job. She's the one who doesn't actually get out of the patrol car. She's the one who says that, oh, well, the only people who are dying are these criminals who are killing each other. Fair enough. I'm gonna go home and relax. I'm gonna collect overtime and then let someone else worry about it. What we did, the real revolution in policing that led to these dramatic gains, was basically creating the sense of esprit de corps and responsibility, the sense that if you do the right thing, you will be celebrated and rewarded, that you will be valued by your community. Once you undermine that, the whole edifice can start to crumble.
Good policing is fundamental to civil society. We have got to get it right. The full hour-long interview with Reham Salam, president of the Manhattan Institute, is on prageru.com. And that's all for this week. We'll catch you next Friday for The Other Side Australia. And on Tuesday night, remember The Other Side interviews streaming at 6 p.m. and available on demand at any time thereafter, as always. And don't forget this show, The Other Side Australia, your weekly short-circuit summary of the news and commentary of the week, streaming every Friday night first at 8 p.m. on ADH TV. And if you like our shows, and if you like ADH TV, please remember our saying, don't just like it, share it. The independent media really needs your active support to keep on doing what we're doing. So have a great week, and we'll see you soon.